My name is Staff Sergeant Amanda Cole, 36, United States Army Logistics Division. I've survived ambushes, deployments, and insurgent fire. But nothing prepared me for the day I came home early and heard my own sister whisper my husband's name. The operation that followed wasn't revenge. It was procedure. What would you have done? My name is Staff Sergeant Amanda Cole, U.S. Army, 36 years old. 15 years in uniform. Half my life defined by discipline, the other half by silence. I serve as a logistics NCO at Fort Liberty, the kind of post where the air hums with generators, the cadence of boots never stops, and coffee tastes like motor oil. Most days I handle manifests, fuel requests, convoy rosters. Order, precision, and readiness. That's my comfort zone. At home, it's quieter, though not in the way I once imagined. My husband, Mark, works as a civilian defense contractor, a job he likes to describe as adjacent to the mission. He means he sits behind a desk that funds the kind of work I actually do in the field. I used to laugh at the phrasing until it started to sound like a subtle jab. He liked to tell people, Amanda's the organized one. I'm the ideas guy. Lately, the tone behind it carried a little too much amusement, like being organized meant small. Then there's Chloe, my younger sister. 30, charming, always camera ready. She's what my mother calls a connector. I call her Chaos with a social media account. She built an online following off polished photos of military life, flags, folded hands, gold light through kitchen windows. Except she's never served. She's lived off proximity to it. Her posts are about sacrifice and strength, hashtags written from the comfort of her spotless apartment, funded by sponsorships and luck. At family dinners, my parents would beam at her. She's such a good influence, my mother would say. You two balance each other out. Amanda, you're the serious one. Chloe's the sunshine. I'd nod, chew my food, and wonder what it would take for them to see discipline as a kind of warmth, too. Mark and Chloe clicked easily. Too easily. He laughed at her jokes about how military time should come with subtitles. She'd tease him about his serious contractor face. I brushed it off as harmless because that's what strong people do. We compartmentalize. But somewhere between the teasing and the family cookouts, I began to notice how the air changed when they were in the same room. Tiny pauses. Lingering looks, shared smiles that stopped when I turned around. Still, I ignored it. Soldiers don't jump at shadows. We wait for patterns. My life had trained me to catalog details before acting. And the details began stacking up. Mark's travel schedule shifted. More weekend conferences, more urgent client dinners. Chloe's posts started appearing in the same cities at the same times. Once, she posted a picture from a DC rooftop bar with the caption, "Mission accomplished." He'd told me that night he was in Arlington for meetings. I laughed when I saw it. The kind of laugh that hides unease behind teeth. But the real tell was subtler. Chloe began to borrow my things. A jacket. A bracelet. Then one day, the silk robe my mother had given me before deployment. Ivory with pale blue stitching. Something I'd never even worn myself. When I asked for it back, she smiled and said, "It looks better on me, don't you think?" I told myself I was overreacting. That exhaustion from long days was feeding suspicion. I told myself that family was sacred, that loyalty came before pride. I'd lived my whole career believing that. Still, something in me, the part that knew how to listen for the difference between silence and danger, started to stir. In the Army, we're trained to trust our gut, but only after verifying intel. Never act on emotion. Gather facts. Confirm patterns, then act decisively. So I waited. I logged. I let the pattern write itself. At work, I was Sergeant Cole, precise and unflappable. At home, I was Amanda, the woman who smiled at her husband's jokes, answered her mother's calls, and pretended not to see her sister's perfume bottle left on the edge of my bathroom sink. And somewhere in between those roles, something cold and clear began to form. An awareness that the next time I came home early, the silence waiting for me might not be the peaceful kind. The pattern didn't explode overnight. It spread slowly like rust under paint. At first, it was the little things. Mark's humor shifted from gentle teasing to casual dismissal. If I corrected a detail in one of his contractor stories, he'd chuckle and say, "You're so by the book, Sergeant. Relax, we're not on the parade ground." At first, I smiled back. Soldiers are used to swallowing small slights in the name of discipline. But over time, his tone began to echo something else. Contempt disguised as charm. He'd host friends for dinner. Men from his company. Wives who wore designer boots and spoke in acronyms they didn't understand. When they'd ask about my deployments, Mark would interject before I could answer. "She can't say much." He'd grin. "Classified, you know. Even I don't get the full download." They'd laugh, and I'd force a polite smile while my sister poured wine at the table like she belonged there. Chloe had started visiting more often. "To help you unwind," she said, showing up with candles and playlists labeled Soft Focus. She'd hug Mark just a second too long, compliment his discipline as if it were hers to admire. My mother would text me later. "Be nice to her. You're the strong one." The phrase landed like a punch every time. It was the same script they'd handed me since childhood. Absorb the blow, maintain control, keep the peace. But beneath the calm, something in me was taking notes. Soldiers survive by observation, by watching before moving. I began to see through their small performances like glass. Mark started forgetting to tell me about weekend trips. Chloe began wearing new jewelry suspiciously similar to what he'd bought me last Christmas. The pieces matched down to the clasp. She'd post photos with captions like, "Always support those who serve." The comments poured in. Hearts, flags, gratitude. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so calculated. At work, my patience began to thin in ways I couldn't show. I snapped at a private during an inventory check, then apologized immediately. The young soldier looked at me with wide eyes, nodded, and said, "All good, ma'am." But his tone carried that weight, the same one I felt inside, pressure building under the surface. The next morning, I ran 5 miles before dawn, trying to burn the noise out of my head. The air smelled like gun oil and pine resin, cleaner than anything at home. When I came back, Mark was still asleep, one arm sprawled across the bed like a man who owned peace by default. I stood there longer than I should have, studying the quiet arrogance of it. At breakfast, he looked up from his phone. "You know, Chloe's thinking of starting a veterans podcast," he said casually. I froze halfway through pouring coffee. "She's not a veteran." "Yeah, but she's inspired by you," he replied, as if that made it better. "She said you could come on as her first guest." I set the mug down so gently it barely made a sound. "Tell her to clear it through public affairs first," I said, then walked out before the silence turned into something sharper. By the time the weekend came, Chloe had started showing up without warning. "Just wanted to see you two," she'd say, her perfume, vanilla and gardenia, clinging to the air long after she left. One evening, I came home from the motor pool to find her car parked in our driveway. Mark claimed she'd dropped off some documents for Mom. Her lipstick print was still on a wine glass in the sink. That night, while folding my uniforms, I noticed something missing from my closet. The ivory robe, my mother's last gift. I stared at the empty hanger for a long moment. My throat felt dry, but my pulse was steady. That was when I knew. Something final had shifted. This wasn't about a marriage fraying or a sister overstepping. This was infiltration. Coordinated, careless, and confident. And they believed I'd never notice because I was disciplined. Because I was the strong one. They were right about one thing. I wasn't going to react. Not yet. In combat, patience is the sharpest weapon. You let the enemy grow certain, comfortable, overconfident. And then, when the moment comes, you take everything back in one clean, precise motion. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was tactical. It happened on a Friday afternoon, the kind of quiet, gold-lit day that makes you think everything is fine right before the world cracks. I had been released early from base after a week of flawless logistics drills. My commanding officer had pulled me aside that morning and said, "Cole, you ever think about moving up to instructor duty? You've got the steadiness for it." I smiled, saluted, and left the office with a rare lightness in my chest. On the way home, I stopped at a small shop outside Fayetteville and picked up a bottle of Elijah Craig 18-year bourbon, Mark's favorite, and a card with a simple line embossed on the front. "You earned this." It was supposed to be our night. I wanted to celebrate the next chapter, maybe remind both of us what peace looked like. I didn't know that the next chapter had already been written without me. When I turned onto our street, the first thing I noticed was her car. Chloe's white Lexus, parked crookedly in the driveway like it had nowhere to be. I sat in the truck for a full minute, my engine idling. Maybe she'd stopped by to borrow something again. Maybe Mark had invited her for dinner. Maybe I was paranoid. The front door was unlocked. That was the second detail. I remember how the light fell across the entryway, slicing through dust in the air. The smell hit next. Not just Chloe's perfume, but a sharp trace of wine and something faintly sweet, like vanilla lotion. My pulse slowed. It didn't race, it steadied. My training has always done that. Drop my heart rate when most people panic. There were shoes near the stairs. Not mine. Not Mark's usual running pair. These were leather loafers, Chloe's taste. I moved quietly, my weight balanced on the balls of my feet, every step deliberate. Years of CQB drills, clearing corners, reading angles, had trained me to move like water without a sound. Halfway up the staircase, I heard it. A laugh. Soft, breathless, followed by a low voice I knew better than my own. "You're a real woman, Chloe. She's just a soldier." I froze. The words didn't hurt. They detonated. Something clean and precise shattered inside me. My mother's silk robe flashed through my mind. Ivory fabric, blue stitching, folded carefully at the back of my closet. I didn't need to look. I knew she was wearing it. I stepped forward once, just enough to see through the small crack in the door. The sunlight hit the edge of the robe, the same one I'd refused to wear because it felt too sacred. My sister, my own blood, was draped in it like a costume. For a second, the world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing. Every sense sharpened. Light, scent, detail. There was no rage, no tears. Only the silent soldiers know before a strike. I stepped back down the hall, quietly, smoothly. Entered the guest bathroom across from our bedroom, closed the door, and took out my phone. My hands were steady when I opened the recorder app and pressed the red button. For 3 minutes, I stood there, unmoving while betrayal became audio evidence. Every whisper, every careless word, their voices weaving the rope they'd hang themselves with. When it ended, I saved the file, labeled it Operation Downfall, Phase 1. Then I turned on the faucet. Not to wash my hands, but to hear the sound of running water, the only noise that didn't feel contaminated. I stared into the mirror above the sink. My reflection didn't look broken. It looked ready. In the Army, we're taught that reaction is weakness. Information is power. The mission is never emotional. You gather intelligence, you confirm, and you strike only once, decisively. That night, I didn't confront them. I didn't scream or cry. I waited until they left. The house fell silent again, except this time it wasn't a silence that hurt. It was a silence that planned. I sat at my desk, opened a new file on my laptop, and typed the heading: Objective, Contain, Expose, Neutralize. Underneath, one line in all caps: Do not engage until control is absolute. That's when the wife in me was gone. Only the soldier remained. The 3 days that followed were a study in quiet logistics. I traded sleep for paperwork and caffeine for focus. The soldier in me treated it like any other intel-gathering mission. Secure the evidence, validate the sources, build a timeline, and then pass the package to the right authorities. Emotion had been useful to point me in a direction. It was useless now. Facts were everything. First rule: preserve the scene. I went back through the house without touching anything they might have handled. The robe, folded now on the edge of the bed where Chloe had left it, was photographed in place. Multiple angles, a ruler for scale, natural light, and a flash shot. I recorded the metadata so I'd know when each image was taken. The voice file from the bathroom was copied immediately to 2 encrypted drives and a burner email I controlled. I labeled everything with timestamps. Chain of custody matters. If you're going to present evidence, it has to be credible. I'm not a hacker, and I don't pretend to be one. I also don't break the law. So I limited myself to lawful collection. I pulled the browser history from the family laptop that we both used. There were cached hotel receipts and calendar invites. I checked the shared photo stream. Sometimes people forget that phones sync. One photo file returned with GPS metadata that didn't match Mark's business trip entry. Those little mismatches are exactly the kind of thing that corrodes a forged story. I called an old friend from cyber operations. No favors, only a professional question. Sam, I said, I need help recovering deleted email headers from a third-party server, not to hack anything, just to know what's there and where it points. He didn't ask me why. You still okay with using non-traceable channels? He asked. I heard the caution and appreciated it. Handle it like a CID referral, I said. Document everything, no theatrics. Within a day, he'd sent me a packet, snippets of correspondence, timestamps, and a note about a forwarded file that matched the contract data I'd seen referenced in Mark's work calendar. It was enough to show a pattern, not a smoking gun for criminal filing, but it was a solid thread. Next, I contacted JAG, not to get them to prosecute, but to understand my rights and obligations. Sergeant Cole, the JAG officer said, matter of fact, we can advise you on housing policy, protective orders, and whether anything here overlaps with security reporting obligations. But remember, civilian spouses and contractors aren't covered under UCMJ. Don't do anything that appears to use your position to retaliate. I respected that line. My objective wasn't to weaponize the uniform. It was to use legal, civilian, and corporate channels to hold them accountable. I drafted an evidence binder. Audio file with redundant copies, hotel folios, credit card charges cross-referenced with calendar entries, screenshots of Chloe's posts with timestamps, and a timeline that mapped Mark's business trips to Chloe's social appearances. I printed clean copies for myself and made a certified, time-stamped backup at a commercial service. Paper trail matters, especially when people will later claim manipulation. I also reached out, carefully, to a civilian contact at Mark's company, someone I'd met at a base outreach event. Listen, I said, once introductions were made. I'm not here to cause a circus. I'm concerned about possible conflicts of interest and misused access. I can share documentation if you need to follow policy. He didn't want names on the first call. He wanted facts. I sent a secure packet. Within hours, I had confirmation that someone in security had opened an inquiry. That reaction told me the mechanisms I'd set in motion were working. Meanwhile, I secured my personal safety perimeter. I changed passwords, logged out of shared accounts, and moved valuables to my mother's house under the pretense of a weekend trip. I installed a small cloud backup for my phone and set two-step verification across everything. No dramatics. Just the kind of procedural precautions we teach juniors before a high-risk movement. I kept a running narrative of all the steps I took, the who, the what, the when, because later, if anyone tried to muddy the record, a clear sequence of actions would cut through the noise. That evening, over coffee gone cold, I read through the timeline and felt a strange clarity. The evidence was not about shame. It was about accountability. And accountability lives in the light, not in whispers. When the time came to confront them, I wanted the room to know the truth and the institutions to take over from there. The operation wasn't personal theater. It was a procedural handoff. That's where I found my leverage. Procedure, documentation, and the slow, inevitable machinery of consequence. By the time I reached the confrontation stage, everything that could be documented was. The file was airtight, the timeline unbroken, and every copy of evidence mirrored across 3 separate drives. I didn't move impulsively. I moved because the conditions were right. In the Army, we call that a window of operation. You don't open it. It opens for you. And if you hesitate, it closes forever. I typed a short message to both of them on my phone. My house, 1900 hours, not optional. No explanation, no accusations, just orders. At exactly 1840, I set the living room the way I would set up a debriefing room. The curtains drawn, the lights at half strength. A small coffee table served as the command center. My laptop opened to a black screen, a small Bluetooth speaker beside it, and 3 glasses lined perfectly in a row with 1 bottle of bourbon between them. Not for celebration. Symbolism. Controlled hospitality. At 1900 sharp, the doorbell rang. Mark entered first, wearing that casual arrogance of a man who still believed he controlled the narrative. "What's with the formal invitation, Sergeant?" He joked, flashing that half-smile he used whenever he needed to neutralize tension. "Sit down," I said. The tone was clipped, professional. He obeyed without realizing it. Chloe followed a few minutes later, nervous but trying to hide it under perfume and pretense. "Is everything okay?" she asked, voice trembling just enough to seem innocent. "Sit," I repeated. The room went still. I stood in uniform, clean fatigues, boots polished to inspection standard. No jewelry, no visible emotion, just posture. "This is a briefing," I began. Topic: breach of trust and security. Mark blinked. "Amanda, what?" Silence. The word came out sharp, command tone. I reached for my phone, pressed play on the recording, and the first sound out of the speaker was Chloe's voice. Then his. Then the phrase that had ended everything. "She's just a soldier." Mark's jaw tightened. Chloe went pale. 15 seconds of truth was enough. I stopped the playback. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. "Audio evidence," I said evenly. "Time stamped, chain of custody preserved. Location verified by ambient sound markers and metadata." Mark tried to speak again, but I raised a hand. "Next." The laptop screen flicked to life. Slide after slide. Hotel folios, credit card statements, Chloe's posts geotagged in the same cities. Each piece aligned like rounds chambered in sequence. I didn't narrate. I simply clicked. Facts speak louder than anger ever could. Mark slumped forward, face in his hands. Chloe began to cry. Loud, practiced, the same old performance she'd used to erase consequences her entire life. "You've always had everything," she choked out. "The respect, the career, Dad's approval. I just wanted something for myself." I looked at her steadily. "You wanted to steal what someone else earned. That's not wanting. That's parasitism." Then I turned to Mark. "You compromised your marriage, your contract ethics, and potentially your clearance. You'll receive an official report from your firm's security division within 48 hours. I submitted the documentation this morning. You will cooperate fully." He stared at me, color draining from his face. "You reported me?" "I reported a breach," I said. "Not a husband, not a sister, a breach." I slid 2 envelopes across the table. One labeled divorce filing, the other property transfer. "You have 24 hours to vacate this residence. The key cards will deactivate at 1900 tomorrow. Any attempt to return will trigger a police report. Chloe, you are barred from all contact. I've already filed the paperwork." Neither spoke. The silence was the closest they'd ever come to respect. I stood, straightened my sleeves, and delivered the closing line the way I would end a field briefing. Calm, absolute. "The debrief is over. The verdict is final. Dismissed." Mark stood slowly, eyes glassy, searching for the man who used to hold power here. He didn't find him. Chloe followed, head bowed, silent for the first time in her life. When the door shut behind them, I didn't smile. I didn't pour the bourbon. I simply reached for my laptop, saved the document, and closed it with a single click. The operation wasn't revenge. It was accountability, executed cleanly, lawfully, and without hesitation. The soldier in me hadn't come back to destroy them. She'd come back to restore order. The next 72 hours moved with surgical precision. Once a mission ends, emotion doesn't get a vote. Procedure does. Every task had a checklist, and I moved through it like clockwork. By dawn the next morning, my phone was already pinging. First, from Mark's company's facility security officer, a retired colonel I'd met once at a charity event. The message was brief and cold. Sergeant Cole, your concerns have been escalated to internal security and legal. Thank you for your professionalism. Further updates will follow. It didn't need to say more. I knew the process. A contractor caught in an undisclosed relationship with someone tied to military public relations or sponsorship networks could face an immediate clearance suspension. It wasn't personal. It was protocol. By noon, I heard from a colleague inside Mark's firm. She texted a single sentence. He's been called into a meeting. HR, legal, and security all present. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I knew that conversation's anatomy. It starts with a request for clarification, followed by the quiet sound of a badge being deactivated. At 1400 hours, I watched from my truck parked on the opposite side of the parking lot. Mark walked out carrying a cardboard box. Standard issue for professional disgrace. He didn't see me. I didn't stay long. Chloe's downfall came faster than I anticipated. Less than 24 hours after the confrontation, one of her military lifestyle sponsors reached out to me, an executive from a banking brand that prided itself on integrity. Her email was polite but direct. Sergeant Cole, we've received concerning documentation regarding Ms. Chloe Bennett's conduct. Could you confirm authenticity? I confirmed. A day later, her contracts were terminated under the morals clause, the same clause she once bragged about never worrying over. The brand scrubbed her photos from their website before sundown. Another sponsor followed, and another. Within 48 hours, the algorithm that had built Chloe's influence began tearing it down. Her follower count dropped in real time. I didn't gloat. I documented. Every action had its paper trail, just like any field report. When people lose status, they don't change overnight. They unravel slowly. Chloe's messages started at anger. Short, defensive texts. Then came the guilt appeals. You're ruining my life. You're my sister. Please stop this. I didn't answer. Silence isn't cruelty. It's containment. Eventually, she stopped messaging altogether. Mark was quieter. The only message I received from him read, "You didn't have to go nuclear." I typed a reply, then deleted it. There's no reason to explain accountability to someone who only understands consequence when it hurts. At work, I carried on like nothing had changed. Morning PT, logistics brief, range drills. The soldiers under me didn't know, and they didn't need to. The discipline of professionalism is armor. Once you put it on, it protects you from your own thoughts. But the calls from home were harder to ignore. My mother left 3 voicemails in a row. Honey, your sister's devastated. Can't you two talk this out? Family is family. Then my father, his voice still sharp with command even after retirement. This isn't the way we handle things, Amanda. You embarrassed her. You embarrassed us. I let both messages sit unanswered. You can't reason with people who confuse silence with peace and forgiveness with surrender. Instead, I called my commanding officer. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my tone even. "I need a formal change of residence form. I'm moving out of base housing within the month." She didn't ask why. She just said, "Understood, Sergeant. Handle your transition. You've earned your steadiness." That night, I sat alone in what had been our living room. The space felt too clean, too empty, like a stage after the actors have gone home. The robe, my mother's, hung on the back of a chair, freshly laundered, folded with the same precision I use on a uniform. For the first time, I could look at it without shaking. It was no longer a symbol of what had been desecrated. It was proof of what I'd reclaimed. The noise of their lies had been replaced by the quiet hum of my own order. The chaos was gone, replaced by something stronger. Clarity. And clarity, I realized, is the final stage of discipline. The weeks that followed felt eerily calm, like standing on a firing range after the last round has been fired. The air still carrying the echo, but the danger long gone. My house no longer felt haunted. It felt sterile, quiet, mine. Every trace of them, their scent, their laughter, their noise, had been scrubbed away. What remained wasn't emptiness, it was order. I rebuilt my life in small, deliberate rituals. Each morning, I brewed coffee at 500, just before sunrise, and sat on the back porch overlooking the longleaf pines. No phone, no distractions, just the stillness that discipline affords. Then I'd clean my rifle, not because I needed to. I wasn't deploying anywhere. But because maintaining something precise and mechanical reminded me that I still had control over what mattered. Process, standard, integrity. At work, I poured myself into instruction. The Army had approved my transition to the Special Warfare Training Center, where I began mentoring younger soldiers on field logistics and leadership under pressure. My lessons were less about gear and more about composure. I'd tell them, "You'll be judged not when the plan works, but when it fails. That's when people learn what kind of soldier you really are." They'd nod, take notes, and never know that those words were drawn from a personal war I'd fought in silence. By the third week, I had moved into a small off-post apartment. Nothing fancy, just clean lines, white walls, and sunlight. I furnished it with what remained of my own choosing: a simple oak desk, a couch, and one framed photo of my unit. No family portraits, no sentimental clutter. Sometimes at night, I'd receive texts from old acquaintances. "Heard about Mark. That's rough. Saw your sister's name in a statement from her sponsors. You okay?" I'd reply with a single line every time. "All handled. Thank you." The truth was, it was handled, not just externally, but internally. I no longer replayed their betrayal or the sound of that recording. I no longer questioned what I could have done differently. Betrayal isn't a puzzle to be solved. It's a storm to be endured. Once it passes, what remains is clarity, and the ground you choose to rebuild on. A month later, during a quiet evening at a diner in Southern Pines, I met an older veteran, retired Marine gunnery sergeant, silver hair, steady gaze. He'd noticed my bearing before I'd even spoken. He gestured to the empty stool beside him. "You Army?" he asked. I nodded. 15 years. He raised his coffee cup. "You made it through. That's enough." He didn't ask what I'd been through, and I didn't volunteer it, but his words lingered long after he left. "You made it through. Not you won, not you survived. You made it through." There's a difference. Winning is temporary. Making it through means you carried your integrity to the other side intact. It became my quiet mantra. In time, I started something new. Informal meetings at a coffee shop near base every Thursday evening. No agenda, no rank, just soldiers, mostly women. Sometimes young men who needed space to talk about what respect really means when you wear the uniform. We didn't discuss combat. We discussed boundaries, dignity, and the difference between strength and endurance. I never mentioned Mark or Chloe. They didn't deserve to be characters in anyone else's lesson. But the wisdom born from that ordeal, the quiet kind that costs you peace before it gives it back, found its way into those conversations. 6 months later, I heard through a colleague that Mark had relocated to another state, working in a private logistics firm under contract review. Chloe had vanished from public view entirely. No posts, no sponsors, no interviews, just silence. And for once, that silence didn't bother me. It suited them. My story didn't end with revenge. It ended with restoration. Not of relationships, but of standards. I didn't need to destroy them. I needed to rebuild myself without them. One night, I took the last remaining digital folder labeled Operation Downfall and dragged it into the recycle bin. A small window appeared. Are you sure you want to permanently delete these files? I clicked yes. The screen went blank for a moment, then returned to normal, just like my life. For the first time in a long while, I exhaled without weight on my chest. I hadn't won a war. I'd simply walked off the battlefield with honor still intact. Sometimes, justice isn't about destruction. It's about discipline, the kind that lets you stand tall when the truth finally comes to light. I didn't fight them. I just refused to let their chaos dictate my peace. Because in the end, strength isn't in the noise or the reaction. It's in the calm after. The moment you realize you don't need anyone's downfall to reclaim your own ground. Have you ever seen someone underestimated until the quiet truth changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss our next story. New episodes of Echoes of Revenge drop every day. Stories of protocol, respect, and hidden strength. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest justice there is.